We are back. Sam Seder on the Majority Report on the phone. It's a pleasure to welcome to the program instructor of political science at University of Washington, blogger at Lawyers, Guns, and Money, and writer at a myriad of outlets across the web. Scott Lemieux. Scott, welcome to the program.
Always great to be with Sam.
All right, so Brett Kavanaugh. Let's start with first, just sort of like briefly, like a bio about this guy. Well, I want to start here, okay? Just before we even get to Brett Kavanaugh, there are now reports by NBC News that Kennedy was in negotiations for months with the Trump administration about getting Kavanaugh in. Give me your reaction to that.
Yeah, and I've been looking into that, and right now, we don't, it seems to be coming from a single source. So, how much, how active the negotiations were, I don't know. But it's certainly, at a minimum, it seems pretty clear that, Kennedy resigned in part because he wanted Trump to nominate a successor. I don't think it's a coincidence that it was before the midterms to ensure the Republicans still have the Senate. I find it very credible that he tried to persuade Trump to nominate Kavanaugh, his former clerk. So, even sort of taking the most minimalist angle, I think it still is relevant about Kennedy's legacy that he doesn't seem to have left because he was, dealing with some kind of severe health issue. But, as is the case with many justices, left because he wanted Trump to nominate his successor. So it sort of shows you, how tight the symbiosis is between Trump and the Republican Party. And really, the Supreme Court is one of the reasons both why a lot of Republicans swallowed their misgivings and voted for him in November, and why Republicans in Congress have given him, complete free pass for whatever he wants to do and not conduct an oversight. Because of this, because he, the federal courts are one area where he just, delegates to Republican activists and just selects Orthodox conservatives. But I was surprised that certainly, if those reports are true, that's pretty remarkable.
Well, I mean, how appropriate?
Any law, but it's pretty inappropriate. Yeah.
I mean, it seems to me, right? I mean, because there was a half dozen major cases in front of the Supreme Court that it appears either Kennedy was the swing vote or the sort of the punt vote, right? I mean, like, Kennedy supposedly was waiting for a decade for these gerrymander cases to come back with a mechanism to determine whether or not a district has been overly gerrymandered. And it came and he punted. There seems to have been a couple of cases like that. I mean, I know there's no conflict of interest, guiding principles for the Supreme Court, but this seems to be, is it precedented in any way?
Yeah, I certainly have never, again, it's not uncommon. There's no question, did, Stevens and Souter wait until there's a Democratic president, although they had been nominally appointed by Republicans, they're liberals. O'Connor, famously noted that she wanted George W. Bush to pick her successor. But I'm not aware of that. There are two things here. First is to say, I'm not aware of, actually contacting the president in advance and asking if they would nominate a former clerk. I've never heard of that before. And you're also right to note that this really sort of hard right turn Kennedy, took this term. Obviously he's always been more conservative than liberal, but basically this term, he, voted with the conservative wing on every major case, including, the Texas redistricting case, which basically makes the Voting Rights Act unenforceable, the Trump travel ban case, and as you say, in the one case in which he really seemed to be leaning liberal in the gerrymandering case, he basically just refused to take sides at all,
right.
Which, as you say, basically means that Kavanaugh gets to decide that case, which almost certainly will mean that even the most extreme partisan gerrymanders won't be ruled unconstitutional. So it maybe helps to explain why Kennedy sort of lurched as far to the right as he did in his last term, sort of almost a preview of what the court's going to look like when if Kavanaugh's confirmed.
Right, except for Kavanaugh is going to come in with probably 30 years ahead of him, whereas Kennedy
Right.
obviously was in his 80s. All right, so give us just the background of Kavanaugh. This guy, even I guess when he was up, and I don't know when this was, when he was up for his first federal court appointment, I think Durbin said something like he was either the Zelig or the Forrest Gump of the Republican Party, because this guy was everywhere. When you look back at the past 30 some odd years, I guess 35 years, and look at every sort of movement conservative moment, Kavanaugh seems to have been there.
Right, and Kavanaugh was one of the judges that was nominated by George W. Bush and was held up when sort of Democrats were using their the filibuster to stop some nominations, and ended up getting confirmed because of the Gang of 14 deal, which I think we can safely say the Republicans won pretty decisively. He was a part of Ken Starr's team. In fact, is seen in some places as one of the primary authors of the Starr Report, and also, as has been pointed out, really was an aggressive leaker. There's a big contrast in the Starr and Mueller investigations. That the Mueller investigation, has been a very tight ship, run very ethically, and the Starr investigation constantly linked information damaging to the president. And Kavanaugh was apparently, according to Jonathan Alter, one of those people. He was part of the Bush legal team in Bush versus Gore. So sort of, he has this long history of really being part of Republican partisan warfare. So you can be pretty confident that that's going to continue. That's a long, that on sort of every stage he's been kind of working with Republicans, pushing a very aggressive, sort of using his legal chops to help advance Republican political priorities.
He was also like part of the Vince Foster conspiracy too, right? Wasn't he like hounding? My understanding is he was in front of the Supreme Court trying to get a subpoena surrounding Vince Foster's suicide.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, he definitely, and he ended up, that was the only case he argued in front of the Supreme Court and he lost. Admittedly, he didn't embrace, the Starr investigation did conclude that Foster committed suicide. Ironically, that's cited today in the New York Times as an example of Kavanaugh being a moderate, which is sort of, that's what the bar is today. That if you don't think Hillary Clinton killed Vince Foster, then you're a moderate. So he wasn't an extreme conspiracy theorist, but yeah, he argued for kind of to have Foster's kind of final thoughts to get them subpoenaed, and the Supreme Court actually rejected that in an opinion written by Chief Justice Rehnquist and joined by his former clerk Justice Kennedy. So he actually lost the only case that he argued in front of the Supreme Court, which is related to the Foster controversy.
If I don't believe that Dick Cheney is actually a lizard changeling, am I eligible for the federal judiciary?
Yeah, apparently that's right. If you don't think right, if you don't think George Bush ordered the 9/11 attacks, then that's I think then you're just completely non-ideological.
Prima facie case for me to sit on the federal judiciary. All right. Well, let's I want to return to particularly that element about him leaking from the Starr report, because when I want to discuss, who this guy is and what we can anticipate in terms of the court, but in many respects, what is really most relevant, and I want to circle back to this, are questions like that and whether or not those are the best lines of attack to attempt to, at the very least, slow the roll of this nomination. But before we get there, let's talk about his track record in terms of the courts, in terms of abortion and birth control and Roe v. Wade. What do we know? What is out there in terms of his writings as to his position on it, or is there any indication whatsoever?
Well, there's, and again, it's always tough to tell, directly from circuit court justices, they are bound by, existing precedents. So Sam Alito voted to strike down a ban on so-called partial birth abortion when he was on the Third Circuit, and then cast the key vote to uphold it when he was on the Supreme Court. But there's a lot of reasons for believing that Kavanaugh is hostile to Roe versus Wade, and the first is just simply that he's supported by the conservative legal community. If you'll forgive the plug, I had an article just go up on NBC News that makes this point that the Federalist Society and Heritage Foundation have just carefully looked at judges to ensure that there's never going to be a David Souter again. They want people who are just really consistent conservative votes. So Jeffrey Sutton, who was a very well-regarded conservative judge, very conservative, 56, seems like a great candidate, and he was basically eliminated for consideration because, he didn't buy the argument that the Affordable Care Act was unconstitutional, which was pretty straightforward at the time. And Kavanaugh, on the other hand, did vote to hold it unconstitutional, despite the fact that precedent seemed to suggest otherwise. So, Kavanaugh is just a very, very reliably conservative vote. So his track record looks everything like Alito and Gorsuch. And so you just, by nature of him being a Republican, you just expect that. But even beyond that, there was a recent case in which the Trump administration has tried to prevent people, immigrants being held from obtaining abortions. And Kavanaugh actually dissented from an opinion, basically, telling the Trump administration to stop it, arguing that, maybe they would like to be in a different country, in a better place when they made that decision or whatever. So they're just sort of little hints that Kavanaugh is almost certainly hostile to that. And, and his record on contraception, just like the Supreme Court, again, has been, generally to allow for religious, exemptions for employers who don't want to provide contraception and so on. So, certainly to the extent that you can read a circuit court record, it certainly looks like he'll be very hostile to Roe versus Wade. And there's just the fact that, he's just a consistent conservative vote suggests that he's going to be hostile to Roe as well.
And we can go through the sort of litany of things. Let's start with this. Is there anything surprising about him? Like, if I was to say this guy is going to vote with Alito or Thomas or Gorsuch, and it's hard to say really who's the most far right of those three, right? Is there anything where I would be surprised, like, oh my gosh, no, not on this?
No, there really isn't. I remember, back arguing about Alito that, there's just, and there was a kind of perception in the media that he was more moderate because he wasn't as flashy as Scalia. But, I wrote at the time, if you're a liberal, you'd rather have Scalia. There are a few things like the Fourth Amendment where Scalia was a little bit idiosyncratic, was kind of more libertarian than some Republicans. You never know. Often justices will have like a particularly quirky issue, but based on his record, he seems like just a completely orthodox Republican, just like this absolutely, nothing surprising at all. Like there's nothing where I would anticipate him voting differently than Alito or Gorsuch would. It's really, part of the reason he got this position is just as unsurprising as possible. There really is nothing, between his long history as within the Republican Party and his voting record, it just seems just completely straightforward. So I guess there's really, based on what we know now, there's really nothing surprising, which means from a liberal perspective, just really nothing to be optimistic about, quite frankly.
There are two things that jump out to me in terms of where he will do, aside from being a vote for, if not directly overturning Roe v. Wade, certainly diminishing the right to get an abortion enough so that it becomes, in a practical standpoint, outlawed in a myriad of states across the country. But there are two concepts that stick out for me when I look at some of his writing. One is his use of the First Amendment in defeating a lot of regulations, right? He did this with, he said that U.S. meat packers don't have to have labels disclosing where each step of the meat production took place because of First Amendment rights.
Right.
He said his FCC net neutrality ruling was also a function of First Amendment violation. He seems to really assail regulations on two fronts. One is on that First Amendment, and the other is on the authority of regulatory agencies to regulate.
Right. So, and first of all, I want to emphasize the point you made about Roe, that way too much attention is being paid to whether, there'll be an immediate opinion announcing the Roe versus Wade has been overruled. And my guess is, at least before the 2020 elections, there won't be, but that's not what to look for. The question is, will the Supreme Court strike down any regulation of abortion? And the answer to that is almost certainly no. So, right to choose doesn't, it's great. It doesn't do much good to have, say, states can't ban abortion, but they can stop any abortion clinics from operating in the state. It's a distinction without a difference. So don't pay attention to what the court says it's doing. Pay attention to what it's actually doing to the laws. And then that's also a fantastic point. One of the cases decided in the last week of the term, which because there were so many has gotten less attention, was the decision to strike down two California regulations requiring disclosure from crisis pregnancy centers. So there's first, so California, among other things, basically required, these, kind of pro-life pregnancy centers that sort of pose as medical clinics to disclose in their advertising that they don't actually offer medical services if they're not licensed. And also, if they were licensed, then they had to, have a sign inside, pointing out that women could have, subsidized access to a variety of reproductive and maternity services. So what's the first irony of that is that the Supreme Court, who struck that down, has also said that, before a woman can obtain an abortion, a doctor could be compelled to read essentially pro-life propaganda written by the state, and women can be forced to listen. So it's Justice Thomas's majority opinion said, well, but childbirth isn't, but this, we're not dealing with medical stuff, which Breyer just incredulously said, what are you talking about? Like the amount of medical care you have to go through in childbirth, it's ridiculous. So that first of all shows that it's very much, these First Amendment cases are decided based, really on viewpoint rather than any neutral principle. But as you say, there's also something broader at stake.
All right, well, wait a sec. Let me just, I want to just, we talked about this ruling a couple of weeks ago, but there was a lot of news around it. So I just want people to marinate in how absurd this is, okay? Where the Supreme Court says it is okay for the state, the state being literally the state, or, I guess theoretically any type of government, to say to doctors, we're going to force you to say something about a medical procedure that you do not even deem to be medically necessary. However, when people come, we're not going to, it's an infringement to force a fake clinic to tell their patients that they're a fake clinic. I mean, this is just, it's insane. It's insane. And it's almost embarrassing that they even put on their robes to do something like this, right? Like, I mean, it's just like, why bother? Why not just, fill in a little checkbox, to put reasoning around that is just absurd. But I just wanted to highlight that for people. But go ahead, because the broader principle here is there's like a two-pronged attack, it seems to me, on the regulatory administrative state, and one of them is the way that they're using the First Amendment. And I don't know, maybe it was a couple of years ago we had the writer Haley Sweetland Edwards on about the corporate free speech racket and how they were using the First Amendment as a means in which to sort of shed themselves, to unshackle themselves from these onerous regulations. But there's another sort of judicial assault on the regulatory state via Chevron. Will you talk about that and explain that?
Sure. Yeah. So you're right. So that's the other implication of this, is that that conservative justices have been and judges have been using, the First Amendment to find expressive content in a way that undermines state regulations like California. So that's, one aspect of it, that, Supreme Court now protects, wealthy donors. There was a famous book about the First Amendment called The Courage of Their Convictions. And Harvard law professor Mark Tushnet said, the next volume could be called The Color of Their Money, given that the First Amendment is now, basically, sort of a way to protect sort of corporate interests and allow them excessive influence in politics. And then, as you say, the other element is for a long time, and this was a doctrine once strongly favored by conservatives, the Chevron precedent says that, the court should defer to any action by regulatory agency that is sort of a reasonable interpretation of the law. So that, unless, the authorizing statute very clearly prohibits what the regulatory agency did, then the court should defer to that. So that the court shouldn't second guess the regulatory agency as long as they made a reasonable determination. And, given the sort of gridlock in Congress, obviously, the ability of administrations to sort of, issue regulations are sort of a crucial, part of functioning modern government. And of course, Republicans want to, basically stop that wherever possible. So there have already been indications that Chief Justice Roberts has sort of moving away from that doctrine. And there's good reason to believe that Kavanaugh will as well. So, and again, whether or not Chevron is formally overruled or not, certainly I think you're going to see this Supreme Court be a lot more willing to second guess, particularly liberal regulatory decisions. So when the EPA, for example, tries to regulate clean water, that or to regulate carbon emissions or whatever, you're going to see the Supreme Court saying, we're not convinced, send it back. So that's going to be a real, and that's the thing. So even when even if the Democrats take over in 2021, if this court is in place, that could be a really severe limitation on what a Democratic president can do in terms of using his or her regulatory authority. So,
now,
it's a big deal. There's basically a two-pronged attack.
And conservatives have come a long way on this, right? I mean, because we can look at that concept that is embedded in Chevron, sort of, from arm's length, and say, okay, presumably the people in these agencies, right? The Environmental Protection Agency, the food, the food safety or the drug safety. I mean, these are all, experts. They're scientists. They're people who've worked in this field. They know how to execute the broad mandate that they have been given by Congress. And conservatives were okay with Chevron back when Ronald Reagan was in charge of the presidency, right?
Right.
But when it became clear that, there are more people who are starting to get interested in actually protecting citizens or consumers or workers, and they seem to be sort of moving down the road. We got to dial that back when we have someone in office who is willing to basically say to their Environmental Protection Agency head, do not protect the environment. And that's basically what it comes down to.
Yeah, it's not a coincidence that conservatives celebrated the Chevron doctrine when Reagan was in the White House and federal courts are relatively liberal. So the perception of conservatives were that, Reagan was trying to, deregulate and federal courts wouldn't let them, basically saying that, that wasn't fulfilling the purpose of the statute. So conservatives developed this theory that, you should defer to the executive branch. But now that they perceive control of the regulatory state as being an important tool of Democratic presidents, especially given that the advantages they have, which make it very difficult for Democrats to control both houses of Congress for any length of time, they've basically changed their mind. So that essentially, when a Republican is in the White House, they're often just not going to take action. But when Democrats are in the White House, it's an important tool. So yeah, it's not a coincidence that basically the conservative perception is switched on this based on what they expect the policy effects to be. So there's no broader legal principle here. It's really just it's a fairly results-driven change.